Dear Rector and Deans, Your Excellencies, colleagues, family and friends, ladies and gentlemen, and everyone in between. In this lecture, you will hear a selection of a text that you will get later today, a booklet called Africa, Still a Silver Lining. The tie is silver as well. It will also be published on the website of the African Studies Centre and on the Voice for Thought website, where we can also have a discussion, if you like, afterwards. There will be live coverage on Facebook today as well. And you have received 4 thematic maps and 1 info sheet that play a role in what I want to say today, with a lot of thanks to our fabulous designer and map artist, Nel de Vink. In January 2011, I gave my inaugural address as Professor of African Development at this university and as Director of the African Studies Centre in Leiden. It was meant to provoke, and it did. It was called Silver Lining Africa, and given at a moment in history when Africa's economies were booming, but journalism and public opinion in Europe was still full of doom and gloom. Talking about Africa often meant talking about a continent of hunger and disease and violence. In my inaugural address then, I tried to show a much more positive picture. This was partly based on participatory research in Africa, where local people discussed the many changes during their lifetime and reported lots of improvements compared to the lives of their parents and grandparents decades earlier. But they also shared their worries about growing pressure on natural resources and about the impact of resource and identity conflicts. I introduced data about Africa's agricultural development, showing that food production had kept pace with rapid population growth since the 1950s. Indeed, when I was born, Africa had 230 million inhabitants. By the time I delivered my speech in 2011, it was more than 1 billion. And today, Africa's population stands at 1,254,000,000 inhabitants, only 7 years later. I showed that Africa's average life expectancy had improved a lot since 1960. Literacy rates have also greatly improved, and recently the African Studies Centre and ICLON published a thematic map on the occasion of a conference about education in Africa by the Netherlands Association of African Studies. That thematic map is one of the handouts. On the back side of that map, it shows that the literacy rate, the number of people who can read and write, has reached majority levels in most African countries, but for men more than for women. And on the front page, it shows that the majority of boys and girls are currently going to school. And yes, compared to everywhere else, Africa is still trailing behind. And this is particularly true for women who live in a belt that stretches from Mauritania to Somalia. And yes, numbers do often conceal the low quality of that education. However, the education now is much better than the situation in 1960. In many parts of Africa, young people today aspire to go to secondary school, and the number of university students has recently exploded. Parents and other family members are prepared to invest a considerable part of their often meager earnings in the education of their children. And with an enormous increase in smartphones and internet reach, many Africans now have access to the same overloads of information as we do. In 2011, I talked about the major economic and political changes since 1960, and I mentioned the many countries with considerable economic growth figures during the first decade of this century. To show what has happened subsequently, I would like to use ice cream imports as a metaphor. See the second thematic map about Africa's international trade that was made together with one of our currently 6 brand new professors at the center, Professor Chibuike Uche. if you go to the upper left corner here, this graph, it shows that in 2001, Africa only imported a little bit of ice cream. By 2014, this had increased sevenfold. And then the ice cream extravaganza began to melt. It's a telling metaphor. First, it shows that consumption of what can be called luxury food items by a growing middle class had increased greatly in those years of Africa's economic boom. Apparently, Africa's infrastructure of ports, supermarkets, and ice cream vendors has reached levels of sophistication where fridges and transport with cooling function well. It also shows that the growth was very much over by 2015. After boom came bust. And of course, one wonders, ice cream imports? Can't Africa produce ice cream itself? The interesting fact is that part of Africa does. In particular, South Africa exports a lot of ice cream to other parts of the continent. But a lot of imported ice cream comes and came from Southern Europe. For Africa's number one economic tycoon, Nigerian entrepreneur Aliko Dangote, ice cream was one of the reasons that he started investing massively in Africa's food industry recently. Let us look at the economic and social performance in Africa between 2001 and 2016. Please have a look at the first page of the info sheet about Africa in the 21st century, which is also in your possession, and which was made together with Dr. Akinyinka Akinyuade of our center. It shows the average changes in the so-called Human Development Index, which measures levels of education and life expectancy in addition to economic performance, and hence is a more comprehensive indicator of development levels. For the economy, the figures are very convincing. Most African economies experienced a boom, with 60% higher real income levels in 2016 compared to 2001. However, while it was party time for Africa's business and political elites, as well as foreign investors, maybe only 20 or 30% of Africa's people really benefited. Africa's growth has been highly inequitable, and public investments often lagged far behind the expansion of the economy, particularly where that economy was dominated by oil, gas, and mining. The graphs about trade dynamics in the thematic map about international trade, we go back to the other map, also show that Africa's exports and imports increased tremendously between 2001 and 2013. Indeed, Africa was clearly emerging as an economic player of growing importance during those boom years. Export and import figures also show how dramatic the economic bust has been during the last 2 years. For products and services together, the year 2016 had 40% less export value than in the peak year of 2012. Finally, this first page of the thematic map about Africa's international trade statistics also shows the geopolitical shift that took place between 2001 and 2016. The United States of America has lost its prominence as the most important destination for Africa's exports to China, the green colors. France lost its pole position to China as provider of Africa's imported produce, while the USA dropped to fourth. Those are the orange colors. Was I right to highlight Africa's positive performance during the first decade of this century in my inaugural lecture in 2011? I still think I was. Can we still talk about a silver lining Africa now, almost 7 years later? I think we can. That said, I certainly don't want to give the impression that everything is bright and shining. Economically, since the end of 2014, there have been genuine reasons for worry again, and much of Africa has become more dangerous again. For the second time, the African Studies Centre has published a thematic map about the security situation in Africa. The first time was at the height of the Ebola epidemic in 2014. Looking again at the security situation in March 2017, it's this map, we see that the former Ebola areas, Sierra Leone, Guinea, and Liberia, are accessible again, but that on the whole, more areas in Africa have become no-go areas with dire consequences for inhabitants, but also for researchers and students from the region and from elsewhere, and hence for on-the-ground knowledge about what is going on. On the reverse of this map, we show the current fragile state index of the Washington-based think tank Fund for Peace. Not only is that map pretty red as well, but if we compare the 10-year changes in the fragility index, the table in the middle of that map, we see considerable deterioration during the last decade. So, despite rapid economic growth during the last 10 years, the social and political fragility and risks have grown. Most of Africa's population lives in countries that have seen a deteriorating security situation during the last 10 years, and these are very worrying statistics. Every time there is a security crisis in an area, it produces people on the move, in forms of calamity migration towards areas that are regarded as more safe. This mobility often happens within countries, but also to neighboring countries or to places further away. Currently, 18% of Somalia's population lives abroad, half of them in neighboring countries and half elsewhere, including Europe. The majority of these people on the move as a result of violence and state breakdown are living in neighboring countries. Other forms of calamity migration are related to the effects of severe droughts. 1.3 million people who used to live in Burkina Faso nowadays call Ivory Coast, Côte d'Ivoire, their home. However, not all migration in and from Africa, and probably the majority of it, can be explained by calamities. So the majority cannot be explained by calamities. Many people are looking for better living conditions. Some of it is because of better economic prospects elsewhere. More than 3 million Egyptians have left their country to work abroad, mostly in one of the Gulf states. Almost 2 million Moroccans have left their country, and that is more than 8% of Morocco's population, and most of them have come to Europe. Nigeria currently hosts almost 1 million people from elsewhere in Africa. South Africa hosts more than 2 million immigrants from all over Africa, but also more than 500,000 who originate from Europe. And South Africa is an example of people being attracted to a country for lifestyle reasons. As one of the very few gay-tolerant countries in Africa, a city like Cape Town hosts many African homosexuals from all over the continent. By the way, it is very wrong to only talk about refugees or calamity migrants on the one hand and economic migrants on the other. Many young migrants also want to explore, to see the world, to fall in love. They want to escape from conditions at home that restrict their creativity or that feel like a prison of old customs that they want to escape, at least temporarily. They want to be away from the old patriarchs, and in some cases matriarchs, who become ever older and who rule countries, counties, and families like feudal estates. These dinosaurs do not want to hand over property and power to the next generation, and certainly not to the angry youth knocking on their doors. Some dinosaurs were forced to step down, though, as former presidents Ben Ali of Tunisia, Mubarak of Egypt, Gaddafi of Libya, Wade of Senegal, Compaoré of Burkina Faso, and Jammeh of the Gambia experienced in recent years. The last map, the thematic map about migration that was made together with Dr. Maaike Kaag of our center, shows the evidence of African people on the move to other countries. According to migration specialist Professor Hein de Haas, who is also present here, migration is a result of aspirations and capabilities. When countries and people have a low development level, as measured by the Human Development Index, especially young people with social media information about the world may have rising aspirations, but low capabilities to actually migrate. In a study based on global data about international migration, Hein de Haas has shown that higher Human Development Index levels initially go hand in hand with much higher emigration levels, while immigration levels are only rising slowly at first. Only at high Human Development Index levels do countries become net importers of migrants, or they are stable. And you can see that in the graph on the right side of the front page. This one. If the same is true for Africa, Africa's relatively fast development during the last 2 decades must have resulted in rising migration levels. And if Africa continues to develop economically and socially, this will result in more international migration, not less, until Africa has reached high human development levels. Indeed, Africa's total outmigration increased from 22 million in 2000 to 33 million in 2015. And indeed, immigration levels still lag behind. The latest revision by the Population Division of the United Nations has been used in this thematic map to check the evidence for 2015. 17 million of those international migrants migrated to other countries within Africa. Of the 16 million Africans living outside Africa, 9 million have gone to Europe, 5 million to Asia and Oceania, and 2 million to the Americas. And you can see that in the graph on the right side. However, migration within Africa was largely a result of turmoil and calamities, and that distorts the picture significantly. If we look at intercontinental migration, migration from Africa to Europe, for instance, Hein de Haase's theory is very much confirmed, although at a lower level than his global calculations of 2010 suggest. Africa's intercontinental migration has only started, and the world better get used to it. The 2 maps on the first page of the thematic map about migration show the numbers and the relative importance, those 2 maps, of Africa's intercontinental immigration, outmigration. For the African countries at a relatively high level of human development, Mauritius, the Seychelles, and Algeria, the weighted average of intercontinental migration is more than 4.5%. For countries with low to medium values on the Human Development Index, like South Africa, Egypt, or Ghana, the weighted average of intercontinental migration is 3%. For countries with a low value on the Human Development Index, currently the majority of African countries and people, the weighted average of intercontinental migration is only 0.7%, 7 out of 1,000. Let us suppose that African countries currently with low scores for human development go up 1 step on the staircase of human development, up to the low to medium level, only step 2 out of 5. Then we can predict that intercontinental migration levels would increase from less than 1% to what looks like the norm of 3%. In terms of people on the move to Europe, Asia, and the Americas, this would mean a substantial increase in the numbers of intercontinental migrants coming from Africa. If Africa's population rises to 1.7 billion by 2030, just 13 years from now, as expected, and most of Africa has reached at least the 2nd tier of the Human Development Index after reaching at least some of the goals of the SDGs, then we can predict that Africa's intercontinental migration will have reached 50 million people instead of the current 16 million. I will deal with these future prospects shortly. But does this mean that Europe should prevent Africa from developing to higher levels of human development in order to avoid massive migration, like Europe did during most of the colonial period, keep them poor, rural, and uneducated? This is a political position that can sometimes be heard and read in social media connected to the extreme right, both in Europe and in America. It will not surprise you that my political position is different. And as a scientist, I say, politicians should first and foremost be realistic and should avoid saying things that might win them votes in the short run, but are counterproductive in the long term, as many voters will be clever enough to differentiate reality from nonsense. But let me first go back to where I started. This intercontinental migration is only a tiny part of what is going on in terms of geographical mobility. An overwhelming number of Africans are on the move in their own countries and within the continent. It is an intertwined mixture of calamities caused by nature, war and oppression, economic motives, social desires, and a quest for adventure, love, and more freedom to live the lives they would like to live. In the thematic map about African migration, The back page shows the other side of the coin, Africa as a destination area, attracting ever more people from abroad and currently a lot from Asia. On the map and in the booklet that will be distributed later, you will see many more details on both outmigration and immigration. And let me select one issue here. According to the World Bank, Africa as a whole received close to $65 billion in remittance income in 2015. Nigeria and Egypt were the most important recipients. But in terms of relative importance, remittances have become a lifeline for small countries like Liberia, the Comoros Islands, or the Gambia, where remittance income has become more than 1/5 of total income, and certainly for Somaliland, where it is more than half. Many governments in Africa recognize the importance of this flow of money. They also see the importance for their government budgets, for contributions to local development projects, and for bringing in investments from abroad, often linked with innovative ideas about economy and society. Many African governments would be very, very reluctant to curb these streams of blessings and hope. Some governments even openly encourage their youth to go abroad and send remittances back home. Let me now turn to the future and go back to the info sheet about Africa. The second page shows that Africa has been experiencing, in this table, very rapid population growth since about 1950. And this growth will continue in the 21st century. The table on page 2 presents the long-term population prospects and compares those with Europe. According to the medium-level predictions of the population specialists of the United Nations, Africa's population will have grown from the current 1.2 billion people to more than 4.4 billion by the end of this century, and Africa's urban population from the current 500 million to 3 billion, as can be seen on page 3. The reason for this continued growth is the fact that Africa's demographic transition started later than elsewhere and from higher levels. It's also slower than elsewhere. The figure about the demographic transition on page 2, this one, comparing all continents and showing the evidence and trends of fertility levels between 1950 and 2100, is a figure that I would recommend you to make the opening page on your mobile, laptop, or desktop. The figure says it all. And make no mistake, Africa's women are currently having less children than their mothers did. But even if Africa's women decided to have only 2 children, the sheer number of girls and young women living today will result in a massive population growth in the next few decades. And Africa has the youngest population on Earth, with a median age around 20, as shown in the map on the page. Soon, the majority of these youngsters will live in cities, ever bigger cities. According to a study quoted in the info sheet, see the map on page 3 again, 6 of the world's 41 megacities will be in Africa in 2030. Lagos will even become part of a super megacity, one big urban coastal belt stretching from Abidjan up to Lagos via Accra, Lomé, and Cotonou. Currently, that city belt already has 33 million inhabitants. In 2100, this Afro-Atlantic city might have more than 130 million inhabitants. More than 4 billion Africans in 2100, most of them in cities, with hundreds of millions in megacities, creates a few challenges for Africa and for the world. But it also creates opportunities. On the last page of the info sheet, you find a summary of what I think the most pressing challenges are, and also the most obvious opportunities. In the booklet that you will receive, there is more explanation. The challenges are huge, and it will be clear that some of the risks may spill over to Europe, particularly in the form of calamity migration, and in the form of exporting radical forms of hatred against those who are regarded as enemies, and against those who are seen as responsible for Africa's predicament due to slavery, colonialism, racism, and exploitation. The current demands in South Africa and elsewhere to decolonize the mind also has elements of anti-European sentiments and reversed racism. The rector asked me to keep this speech brief, so let me skip the challenges and focus on the opportunities so that you can enjoy the drinks afterwards with a glimmer of hope. But please don't tell me later that I have presented a one-sided picture. As we have seen before, population growth and urbanization will result in a major growth in demand for all types of products. Those will overwhelmingly come from the hinterlands of the expanding cities in Africa itself. And that will trigger further economic transformation in those hinterlands. This will include rapid agricultural expansion in terms of area, volumes, and productivity, Africa's green evolution. When economists talk about the impact of population growth, they like to talk about demographic dividend. A predominance of young, energetic people who have gone to school and know how to use social media will create innovations in production and lifestyle. The information revolution will continue. Africa's well-informed youth will formulate political demands for better lives and more equal opportunities. There will also be more remittances as a result of increasing migration, and some of those remittances will come with innovative ideas and examples from elsewhere. We've seen before that Africa is already experiencing a fast demographic transition. African mothers in my age cohort had close to 7 children. Young African girls will now have an average of 4 children during their lifetime. In 2100, it's expected that Africa's mothers will have 2 children on average. However, a lot will depend on the speed of urbanization, on the trust in social security provision, and most of all, on the number of girls who will receive secondary education. Part of the innovation occurring in Africa involves parents investing in the quality of life chances of their children, and they are no longer focused on having big families. Among urban, well-educated and well-connected parents, 2 or 3 children has already become the norm. However, Africa is also experiencing zealous religious campaigns against fertility reduction and political religious resistance to talking about population policies. And don't be fooled by media overexposure of what happens in Islamic societies in Africa. The same zeal can be found among Pentecostal and Catholic circles. And it is also very useful to understand more about African religious ideas, about morality and evil. Let's go back to the positive prospects. The growing connectivity of Africa's economy and information technology is also fueling regional integration. Recent strategy papers by, for instance, the African Development Bank and the African Union, like Agenda 2063, the Africa we want, show much vision and optimism. And I think these visions and plans are more than just rituals. The emerging class of African entrepreneurs goes beyond individual country boundaries. We can see the start of African-owned multinationals active in many African economies, and they are getting used to dealing with different political elites on the continent. Together with foreign investors, these African business and political elites are expanding their investments in infrastructure, partly together with China. And they try to align their strategies to make them regional or even continental. And part of these investments now takes the form of rapid development of green energy solutions. Wind farms, like the huge project in northern Kenya that is almost completed, or the mega investment in Morocco's solar project in the desert. Some of Africa's political and business leadership is currently leapfrogging to green energy and to the next levels of information technology. Many observers note that the move away from cables and physical networks to point-based energy and information solution is particularly suited to Africa. We can also expect major industrialization, partly based on these advances in energy and information technology. African consumption of industrial products will grow significantly and will become much more based on African production. We are also seeing a major expansion of the entertainment industry, and this is expected to grow, with Nollywood's film industry in Nigeria and the activities of the many Pentecostal churches all over Christian Africa, 2 sides of that same coin. One also hears demands for more and better protection of Africa's next generation of industries and services, and pleas for so-called frugal innovation on a massive scale. The current era of protectionism, spearheaded by Brexit and by Trump's election, is fueling protectionist policies in Africa as well. Of course, the future is uncertain, and Africa's future will depend on the complex outcome of the risks and opportunities that I have just sketched. To be aware of what is going on in Africa and what that might mean for Europe and for the Netherlands as a tiny part of global society, we need African Studies Centres. In the Netherlands, we can be proud of the strength and quality of the African Studies Centre in Leiden. That is also an important hub for the Africa-Europe Group for Interdisciplinary Studies, AGIS, and well connected to relevant scholarship in Africa and across the globe. And although I have highlighted the recent past and the future for Africa, let me clearly say that we cannot understand what is currently going on in Africa and what will happen during the rest of this century if we do not study Africa's past and the history of Africa's relationships with the world. Many young Africans are demanding a rewriting of that history, for so long dominated by the language of the global and national political winners. Decolonizing the minds will also mean a massive and bottom-up reinterpretation of Africa's history and connectivity, and it also means connecting the academic world with the world of activists and artists, as experimented in Leiden in the Voice for Thought approach, and in the digital adventure called Bridging Humanities, supported by Brill Publishers. However, most of this work will be done in Africa itself. It has been, and it will be, an adventurous journey, and I gladly hand over my responsibilities for the African Studies Centre Leiden to a historian, Professor Jan Bart Gewalt. Ik heb gezegd.
Comfortable? Good. Dear Tom, we have just listened to your farewell address, which, by the way, isn't exactly a farewell address since you will remain active here at Leiden University and elsewhere to help developing further African studies. But the farewell address did mark the end of your tenure at the helm of the African Studies Centre. And I'm very honored that I can say a few words to you on behalf of Leiden University. For those who do not know me, my name is Wim van den Doel, and I had the privilege to chair the first board of the African Studies Centre after it became part of Leiden University. And after me, your successor, Jan Bart Gewalt, and His Excellency, Minister Bert Koenders, will address you. And then our drinks. I will be brief, because many people here would like to meet you during the reception. And tonight there will be more speeches. Dear Ton, you came to Leiden in 2010 to become the director of the African Studies Centre, as successor of Leo de Haan. You came from the University of Amsterdam, where you received your PhD in 1987 on the thesis Pastoralist in Dire Straits, Survival Strategies and External Interventions in a Semi-Arid Region at the Kenya-Uganda border. It was the result of extensive field work. It was also 1987, exactly 30 years ago. Time flies. It was more or less by accident that you started to study the African continent, because you became a geography student at the Catholic University of Nijmegen in the 70s. Focus of your attention was not Africa, but Indonesia, and you did that in a critical manner. Critical towards colonialism and the colonial past, but also very critical towards the regime of Suharto. We could discuss this regime right now, because it elevated many people out of poverty, but we shouldn't. Because you did not want to do research in Indonesia, which brought you to Africa. In the year after the completion of your PhD, in the years after the completion of your PhD, you continued to do research on Africa, more particular on Kenya and Ghana. You published on the topics of poverty, rural development, arid areas and climate change, and the development cooperation and civil society, all still highly relevant topics. In 1996, you became professor of social geography at the University of Amsterdam. But you were not just a researcher and scholar. You also took up many governing responsibilities. You did not hesitate to become the director of the Amsterdam Institute of Metropolitan and International Development Studies. Between 2002 and 2007, you were the director of CRS, the Research School for Resource Studies for Development. You were member of the board of NWO VOTRO and chair of the Conflict and Cooperation over Natural Resources in Developing Countries program of NWO VOTRO and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. You came to Leiden in 2010. It was a time in which Dutch politics, or a part of Dutch politics, became critical or hostile to the idea of development cooperation. This meant that the future of the African Studies Centre became less self-evident as it was before. And this had nothing to do with the qualities of the African Studies Centre. Your predecessors left the institute in good shape, but the environment was changing, or at least seemed to change. And the African Studies Centre also had to change. You came with a clear message and a new policy. This message was summarized in your inaugural lecture, with the title Silver Lining Africa, from images of doom and gloom to glimmers of hope, from places to avoid to places to enjoy. You just gave us the same message in your farewell address. You're stressing the fact that in Africa many positive developments can be seen as long as we do an effort to see them. The new policy you brought to the African Studies Centre can be summarized giving the centre a new position, literally, in the Netherlands. The African Studies Centre re-established its links with the African Netherlands Business Council, the other offspring of the Africa Institute, which was founded after the war by Mr. K.P. van der Mandelen. The conference Africa Works in 2012 was one of the very good outcomes of this new relationship. But even more important was your decision to steer the ship of the African Studies Centre into the safe harbor of Leiden University. Leiden University enthusiastically welcomed this new policy as it positions itself as the university with knowledge of languages, cultures and societies worldwide. Change is always difficult, especially for those who do not see the big picture. But under your leadership, the discussions between Leiden University and the African Studies Centre became a success, and in December 2015 the agreement between the two parties was signed. Dear Tom, this was truly a very significant result of your work, of which we will see the results in the years to come, also physically, since in a few years' time the African Studies Centre will move to the new Humanities Campus, on which also a new African library will be built, like the university did build its Asian library in the past few years, something to look forward to in the next years. Dear Ton, you have been a very energetic director of the African Studies Centre, always optimistic, not on Africa, but also on the African Studies Centre, always optimistic, making sure the study of the African continent will have its proper place in the Netherlands. That's what you did. The study of the African continent will have its proper place in the Netherlands. And this is important. Africa is Europe's southern neighbor and, as you just said, at the end of the century, home of around 4 billion people. Leiden University is proud to have you as a colleague. The Africa Studies Centre is in great shape. To paraphrase the subtitle of your inaugural lecture, the Africa Studies Centre was never a place to avoid, but sure still very much a place to enjoy. On behalf of Leiden University, I would like to thank you for all this and all you did for African studies in the Netherlands. Thank you very much.
There's a nice little label here. It says, "Mind the steps." I should have minded the steps. Your Excellency, Tom, Namika, everybody else, welcome this afternoon. Thank you very much for being here. Let me start off. As an academic working on African history, I've always been thoroughly fascinated by representations of power and authority as they exist in popular culture in Africa. Now, until independence, district commissioners were the local instruments of British colonial power in much of Africa. These mustachioed men, representing as they did in their persona and former position the very apogee of British colonial power in a district, were themselves the subject of numerous tales and anecdotes that consciously ridiculed and took down a notch the power of the British Empire and its hapless representatives. In Malawi, in Zimbabwe, in Zambia, in Nigeria, grotesque masks caricatured the British Bwana, the big man, in dance and performance that countered the power of the appointed district commissioner. Landek White and Jack Mpanje and others have described workers' songs in which the men digging trenches or hoeing fields cussed the foreman and his colonial master. More often than not, these songs took on a sexual connotation that ridiculed the potency of the colonial master. There's the one, we are digging the hole for him to get in. We are digging the hole for he has left his wife behind. We are digging the hole, and so forth. Now, in the 1990s, I first became aware of the existence of a mustachioed man of power, a true Bwana, a big man who reigned and ruled in the land of African Studies in the Netherlands. Rumors indicated that he reigned supreme in Amsterdam, but that PhD students from around the land flocked to him for guidance and support in their endless search for funding and decent supervision. Fellow PhD students consistently mentioned his name in wonderment. A Dutch PhD student who had innovatively used his substantial PhD funding to establish a new home for himself in South Africa, whilst largely neglecting his intended research, spoke in awe of this Bwana. In particular, his seemingly endless patience, his detailed knowledge of the subject at hand, his dossierkennis, and his willingness to invest in supervising what to all intents and purposes was a lost cause. Through this PhD student, who I'm glad to say eventually did acquire his doctorate, I finally got to meet the great and much rumored Bwana in person. At that stage, Tom Dietz still sported a large moustache. A moustache that would have done any colonial district commissioner proud, and he turned out to be as inspiring and influential as all that the rumors had said and more. All the more so when he became director of the African Studies Centre in 2010. In about 2008, on the way back from a thesis defense in Nijmegen, I remember sitting in a car with Annemieke and Tom and chatting about the African Studies Centre and its position within the Netherlands. At that stage, it was clear to many that unless the ASC drastically changed its course and direction, the Institute seriously ran the risk of being abolished. If the truth be told, through the years, the ASC had developed a privileged position, essentially as a centre with a world-class library in which researchers could do their own thing, whilst expecting the Dutch public to continue paying salaries with little or no return. To some, the perilousness of this situation was evident. The old days of slush funds and endless field trips in the sun were rapidly coming to an end. In 2010, in the wake of the world's greatest financial crisis since the Great Depression of 1929, the first Rutte government came into power, and budget cuts began in earnest. And lest we forget how drastic these cuts were, bear in mind what happened to the Royal Tropical Institute in Amsterdam. This august body, founded with royal patronage in 1864, saw its core funding slashed and its magnificent library literally torn asunder and thrown away. Together with a few of my students, I stood in the row on an early autumn morning in 2013 to salvage some of those books, whilst the library staff of the Royal Tropical Institute stood by and looked on with a heavy heart. The same could have happened to the African Studies Centre. Thankfully, we now had Ton Dietz at the helm. Ton followed a twofold strategy, one external and one internal. Externally, Ton invested heavily in developing links with the outside world and ensuring that the ASC had a smoel, a Dutch word that is almost impossible to translate, but which means something like self-assured, a confident presence. Ton contacted universities, businesses, ministries, individuals, in fact, any institution working on or interested in Africa. And internally, Ton reorganized the ASC. Gone were the sub-kingdoms within the realm that consistently sniped at one another at the expense of research. Instead, Ton established multidisciplinary research groups organized around single themes. Ton completely overhauled accountability within the ASC and ensured that it started operating in a transparent manner, in which it became clear to one and all working within the ASC what each and every one of us was doing, and also at what cost. But above all, Ton steered the ASC into safer institutional waters, into the institutional setting of the university. Within the university, the ASCL operates as an interfaculty institute with its own professors and its own graduate school, an institute committed to teaching and research at the highest level. Late last year, the ASCL weathered its last budget cut, and yet, due to Ton's foresight, we now have reserves that we can invest in staff. Ton and I have been personally to the ministry and been informed that for the foreseeable future, the budget of the ASCL will be safe. Without Ton, this probably would not have been the case. Ton has left me with a remarkable legacy and an enormous responsibility. I have looked for the caricatures, the poems, the anecdotes, the masks that would take down Ton's power and prestige. They do not exist. What does exist is a sense of wonderment and praise that one man could do so very much. Sometimes power is wielded justly and with a firm hand. Ton certainly did. And without his presence and his insight, it is important to bear in mind that it is doubtful if the ASC would have continued to exist without his directorship between 2010 and 2017. So, on behalf of all of us who work within the ASCL, a heartfelt thank you, or as you should now be addressed, Santi sana mzee, shukrani nyingi sana mwalimu. Thank you, venerable man. Thank you very much, teacher. Dank je wel, eerbiedwaardige heer. Heel erg bedankt, onderwijzer. Minister Koenders, het woord is aan u.
Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished professors, Ton, it's an honor for me to speak just a few short words here today. I feel humbled by the sheer amount of knowledge and experience of the continent so close to my heart. Humble is a word that describes you well, Tom. You call yourself a world citizen from the tribe of the Dutch. Others describe you as open-minded, cheerful, intellectually stimulating, an active team player, and a warm, unifying personality. You'd have made an ideal diplomat for the Foreign Service. What a shame we didn't sign you up. Fortunately, our HR people are busy recruiting for a new class, but seriously, you have contributed a great deal to Africa, to research on Africa, and what I particularly appreciate your work for is that, in paradox of what I just said, you speak out clearly and directly on African affairs. You have contributed enormously to our ministry's knowledge of the continent. I'll keep it brief and confine myself to just 3 points. First, Africa is often seen as a continent of myth and mystery. Yet sometimes it's presented in terms that are too simple. In the past, the media have tended to serve up images of doom and gloom, a place full of violence, hunger, and poverty. In Silver Lining Africa, you set out to paint a more positive, nuanced picture. You saw glimmers of hope. You saw the continent as the place to be, not a place to avoid. Of course, there are, and you described them this afternoon, huge problems, conflicts, underdevelopment. But there are also now stronger institutions. Many more people can read and write. A considerable number of countries are showing economic growth. A number of countries improved in governance. There is progress on education and healthcare. In a number of regional conflicts, take the like Chad region and the Gambia, neighboring countries are actively helping to resolve crises. For the future, a lot will depend on how the public sector and the political and economic elites perform, and how the population is active, and whether they can generate equal and inclusive growth. But most importantly, Africa in all its diversity and beauty is not an account of what goes well or not well. It is a formidable continent sui generis. Second, the people of Africa are young. When you were born, Tom, the continent had 230 million inhabitants. Now there are 1.2 billion. Projections vary, but it's safe to say that Africa will have at least 3 billion people by the end of the century, probably more, you described in detail. And the proportion of them will be on the move, as you rightly mentioned. Yes, there is a demographic transition underway, though it's slow, and yes, many people will find a bright future in Africa. But migration to Europe will continue. From a political perspective, this isn't a good or a bad thing in itself, but it needs to be managed far better than it's currently the case. And my sense is that your research, including the one on climate change, geography, politics, and migration, could play a leading role in this. Third, relations between Africa and Europe are changing a lot. In the past, we've closed a number of embassies. That was a mistake. And I'm delighted that we are opening new representations in the African continent, in Niamey and possibly in N'Djamena. Relations between European and African countries need to be strengthened, not weakened, so that we can tackle the world's many challenges together, so we can collectively improve our destinies, so that we can work on energy transition and solar power together, and above all, so we can learn from each other. Tom, it's safe to say you've learned a lot from your time in Africa, in Kenya, Ghana, Burkina Faso, and the other places you spent time and did research. You learned from the culture, the history, the sociology, the geography, the philosophy, the economy, all the many things that intrigue you. Your research methods have empowered local people to write their own development histories. So they have also learned from you, and they appreciate your work. The clearest proof of this is, of course, when Moi University in Eldoret, Kenya, awarded you an honorary doctorate. You made great efforts to attract more African academics to work here in the Netherlands, and I think that is extremely important. And I firmly believe we should do more to attract more African students to our universities. You will now retire, not completely, fortunately, but from this great center, and you will have more time to spend with your family, including your bright granddaughter. Since I know you're always hungry for more knowledge, projects, people, figures, I'm sure we will see more articles from you in the coming years. like for instance on stamps, because collecting them is another great hobby of yours. Ton, I'd like to thank you personally for all that you did and all that you signified. For the people of Africa, for the people of the Netherlands, for academia, the African Studies Centre and Leiden University. For advancing our ministry's knowledge of this great continent and for enhancing the link between policy and research. You played a significant part in further improving relations between Africa and the Netherlands. And for all that, the ministry is very grateful, and I personally am very grateful. Ton, it is therefore my privilege to award to you the Order of Merit of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. This is quite exceptional and an extraordinary decoration, only awarded in very special circumstances and to very special people. Only a few people received this honor in recent time. Frank-Walter Steinmeier, the German Minister of Foreign Affairs at the time, Julie Bishop, and lately Tom Middelkopp, the Chief of Staff of the Dutch Army. I think because of all the work you have been doing and the research, there's no one who better deserves this award than Tom. So now I need somebody around me. Yes, it works. To do something I'm normally not that good at, but I'm going to try to do it on the right side. See, this already is a problem. Tom, I think I need you here. Als je eventjes omkeert, dan kan ik zo omdoen. I don't know how this went. Was the African historian how this went? Here we go. This time on. Yes. And I do this regularly, I tell you. But not this award. This is a very special one for you, Tom.
Without my hat this time. Dear Wim van der Doel, Jan Bart Gewalt, Bert Koenders, thanks for these warm words of appreciation and this beautiful sign. Indeed, my years in Leiden were happy and fruitful. And thanks Marianne Wanders and the organ player for making this a very nice afternoon. I'm truly grateful for the support I received from the former board of the African Studies Centre Foundation, and I would like to thank Agnes van Ardenne, Bernard Berendsen, Jannie Groen, Anton Lenstra and Hans Opschoor for their commitment and support, and for guiding the process of integration with Leiden University. That process was very much supported by the rector, Karel Stolker, by Jan van der Boon, and by the current members of the ASCL board, Wim van den Doel, Hanna Swaap, and Jan-Michiel Otto. I'm grateful to the Department of Cultural Anthropology and Development Sociology for hosting my professorial position in African development since I became director of the African Studies Centre in May 2010. And the good contacts with Gerard Persoon, Peter Pels, and other Africanist colleagues were later expanded with many more Leiden-based Africanists in the Leiden African Studies Assembly, and with other area colleagues in Leiden Global. I would also like to thank the many members of the Scientific Advisory Council of the African Studies Centre, and also our many non-academic colleagues from business, policy, diplomacy, and NGO circles who were and are very connected to our work at the Centre. I would particularly like to thank the many different colleagues in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, with whom I shared many good moments. For instance, discussing the Tracking Development project, the Knowledge Platform for Inclusive Development, and the Stephen Ellis Chair for the Governance of Finance and Integrity. I also want to thank colleagues at the Netherlands African Business Council, with whom the Centre worked together to organize 3 big Africa Works conferences. And it has been a great pleasure to participate in AGES with directors and colleagues of other African studies centers in Europe and elsewhere. It's very nice that its former president, Professor Paul Nugent, and its current president, Professor Clara Carvalho, are here with us today. And I also very much welcome Professor Falaye of the brand new Institute of African and Diaspora Studies of the University of Lagos. But of course, most of my work was at the African Studies Centre in Leiden itself. The support staff, the library staff, the senior researchers, the many junior researchers, PhD candidates, the research master and master students in African Studies, the many visiting fellows of the centre, and the members of the ASCL community have made my work hugely enjoyable and rewarding. In the booklet, there is a word of praise and thanks for all of you, but because of time, let me skip that here. I'm leaving the African Studies Centre Leiden in the capable hands of Jan Bart Gewalt and the care of the Leiden African Studies Assembly in the creative hands of Mirjam de Bruin and Maaike Westra. I hope to continue giving some support here and there, but I also hope to devote more time now to home, family and hobbies. Annemieke, Luc, Richard, Eva and Josephine, thanks for supporting me in what I have tried to do, and thanks for enriching my life so much. And to my 96-year-old mother, who unfortunately can't be here today, I would like to say, half of the genes that brought me here are yours. Thanks for that gift of life and for your tenacity. I certainly inherited that part of your character. I wish Jan Bart Gewalt and the African Studies Centre Leiden the same tenacity, vasthoudendheid. Thank you all.